There is a force within the human mind that quietly shapes the direction of a person's entire life. Most people never see it clearly. They only witness its effects. They see opportunities disappear, relationships weaken, confidence collapse, peace vanish from the mind. And because these effects appear externally, people search for external causes. But according to the teachings of Joseph Murphy, the true cause often begins deep within the subconscious mind itself. For the subconscious mind is not passive. It is constantly receiving impressions, constantly responding, constantly expressing outwardly what has been emotionally accepted inwardly. This is why the thoughts you repeatedly feel become far more important than the thoughts you casually entertain for a few moments. A fearful thought mixed with emotion becomes an impression upon the subconscious mind. And once accepted internally, that impression begins influencing behavior, expectation, perception, emotional reactions, and eventually the entire direction of experience. Most people believe fear is simply an emotion, but fear is far more powerful than emotion alone. Fear is expectation. Fear is mental acceptance of unwanted outcomes. Fear is imagination directed toward disaster instead of harmony. And the subconscious mind responds to imagined fear in the same way it responds to imagined success. It accepts both according to belief. This is why human beings often attract the very experiences they desperately struggle to avoid, not because the universe is punishing them, not because life is cruel, but because the subconscious mind faithfully reproduces the dominant emotional patterns impressed upon it day after day. The mind does not move according to occasional wishes. It moves according to dominant conviction. A man may say, "I want success," but if he secretly expects failure emotionally, fears criticism constantly, imagines humiliation repeatedly, and mentally rehearses disappointment every day, then fear becomes the deeper instruction accepted by the subconscious. The outer words become powerless against the inner emotional pattern. Joseph Murphy taught that the subconscious mind accepts what feels true, and whatever is accepted internally begins expressing itself externally. This principle explains why two individuals can face identical circumstances while producing completely different outcomes. One person sees possibility, the other sees danger. One expects harmony, the other anticipates disaster. One moves forward with calm confidence, the other hesitates under the weight of invisible fear. And over time, these inner expectations slowly shape entirely different lives. Many people unknowingly spend years praying negatively. They repeat fearful thoughts constantly. What if I fail? What if something goes wrong? What if I lose everything? What if people reject me? What if life never improves? These thoughts are not harmless. Every repeated emotional thought becomes a mental seed planted within the subconscious mind. And whatever the subconscious accepts deeply enough eventually seeks expression. This is why chronic fear slowly transforms the personality itself. The fearful individual becomes tense, defensive, suspicious, exhausted, unable to act naturally. The mind loses its flexibility because imagination becomes imprisoned by anxiety. Then the person mistakenly believes the external world created the fear. But often the fear existed internally long before reality reflected it externally. Joseph Murphy repeatedly warned against allowing the imagination to become dominated by destructive expectation, because imagination is one of the greatest creative forces within the human mind. Whatever the mind vividly accepts and emotionally sustains begins shaping subconscious patterns automatically. Fear, therefore, becomes dangerous not merely because it feels unpleasant, but because it conditions the subconscious continuously. A fearful mind eventually produces fearful behavior. and fearful behavior gradually creates fearful results. This cycle continues until the individual becomes conscious of the law operating beneath the surface. For the subconscious mind itself is neither cruel nor kind. It is impersonal. It responds according to impression. It magnifies what is repeatedly accepted. This is why two people can pray for opposite outcomes while internally expecting entirely different realities. One prays with faith. The other prays while emotionally rehearsing failure. And the subconscious always responds more powerfully to emotional conviction than surface-level words. The greatest mistake many people make is believing they can hide fear beneath temporary positive thinking. But the subconscious responds to what you truly accept emotionally, not what you occasionally repeat mechanically. If fear dominates internally, fear eventually shapes perception. It influences choices. It alters reactions. It changes the tone of the voice, the posture of the body, the willingness to act, the ability to trust, and the courage to persist. Eventually, life begins mirroring the internal condition. And when fearful outcomes appear, the person says, "I knew this would happen," without realizing that the fearful expectation itself helped participate in creating the result. Joseph Murphy taught that human beings must become careful guardians of the mind. For every thought combined with feeling becomes part of subconscious conditioning. The mind is always being impressed, always being conditioned, always moving toward what it repeatedly accepts as true. This is why fear must never be allowed to dominate the imagination, because imagination directed negatively becomes a destructive force. But imagination directed constructively becomes one of the greatest powers available to human beings. The same subconscious mind that accepts fear can also accept peace. The same imagination that creates anxiety can also create confidence. The same emotional repetition that conditions weakness can also condition harmony, courage, abundance, and inner freedom. The laws themselves never change. Only the impressions impressed upon the subconscious change. And once a person understands this principle deeply, fear begins losing its mysterious power. Because they finally realize that many of the invisible chains controlling human behavior were created gradually through unconscious mental acceptance. Tonight we will examine these hidden patterns carefully. We will explore why fear becomes self-fulfilling, why worry weakens the mind, why imagination shapes emotional reality, and how the subconscious mind silently transforms repeated thought into lived experience. For once a person learns how the subconscious truly operates, they no longer remain victims of unconscious fear. They begin reclaiming authority over the direction of the mind itself. The subconscious mind is like fertile soil. Whatever is planted within it consistently, emotionally, and repeatedly eventually begins to grow. It does not care whether the seed is constructive or destructive. It does not argue. It does not resist. It simply accepts impressions and moves toward expressing them outwardly through the conditions of the mind, the emotions, the habits of behavior, and eventually the circumstances of life itself. Joseph Murphy taught that the subconscious mind accepts what the conscious mind feels to be true. This means that repetition mixed with emotional conviction becomes extraordinarily powerful. Not because repetition alone possesses magic, but because repetition gradually transforms thoughts into accepted inner reality. Most people underestimate how deeply their repeated emotions shape subconscious conditioning. A passing thought rarely changes the course of a life, but thoughts repeated daily with feeling eventually become internal law. This is why fear becomes dangerous when it is emotionally rehearsed over long periods of time. Many individuals unknowingly spend years impressing fear upon the subconscious mind through constant repetition. They awaken each morning already expecting difficulty. They anticipate disappointment before events even unfold. They mentally repeat the same inner conversations every day. Life never works out for me. Something always goes wrong. I cannot trust people. I will probably fail. I am not good enough. I always lose opportunities. At first, these may appear to be ordinary thoughts, but to the subconscious mind, repeated thoughts mixed with emotion become accepted instruction. Eventually, the subconscious no longer treats these statements as temporary fears. It begins accepting them as descriptions of reality itself. And because the subconscious continuously seeks expression, the individual gradually starts behaving in alignment with those impressions unconsciously. This is one of the great hidden tragedies of human life. Many people are not consciously choosing limitation. They are unconsciously conditioning it. The subconscious mind faithfully reproduces what it has been trained to accept repeatedly. This is why Joseph Murphy emphasized that people must become careful observers of their dominant emotional states. For whatever occupies the mind repeatedly eventually shapes identity. The fearful person may not realize how deeply fear has entered the subconscious, but its effects begin appearing everywhere. Fear influences posture, tone of voice, energy, confidence, decision-making, relationships, persistence, imagination. The fearful individual gradually begins seeing the world through the lens of anticipated danger. Neutral events appear threatening. Temporary setbacks appear permanent. Small criticism feels catastrophic. The mind becomes conditioned toward emotional insecurity. And because perception itself becomes distorted by subconscious conditioning, the individual often believes the external world is creating the suffering. But many times the suffering began internally through years of fearful mental acceptance. Joseph Murphy taught that the subconscious mind accepts what is emotionally believed, not merely what is intellectually stated. This explains why many people fail to change their lives despite repeating positive words externally. A person may repeat affirmations for 10 minutes while emotionally rehearsing fear for the remaining 16 hours of the day. The subconscious always responds more deeply to dominant emotional impressions. Emotion gives thought its power. Feeling gives thought its substance. This is why fearful imagination becomes so destructive. The subconscious responds to vivid emotional imagery almost as though the event were already occurring. If a person continuously imagines rejection, humiliation, illness, poverty, betrayal, or disaster, the subconscious begins organizing emotional patterns around those expectations. The body reacts, behavior changes, the nervous system adapts to fear. And over time, fear becomes normalized internally. Many people become so accustomed to fearful thinking that they no longer recognize it consciously. It becomes automatic. They expect disappointment instinctively. They assume problems naturally. They distrust peace itself because the mind has grown addicted to anticipating danger. This is why subconscious conditioning becomes difficult to recognize after years of repetition. The fearful pattern no longer feels foreign. It feels familiar. And the subconscious mind always moves toward what feels familiar emotionally. Joseph Murphy repeatedly warned that human beings must guard the mind carefully because the subconscious never stops recording impressions. Every emotional reaction strengthens certain internal patterns. Every repeated fearful assumption deepens subconscious acceptance. And eventually the subconscious begins reproducing those conditions automatically through emotional and behavioral alignment. The mind truly becomes what it repeatedly contemplates emotionally. This principle operates constantly, whether a person understands it or not. The subconscious mind is always listening, always recording, always responding, and whatever the individual continues feeling deeply eventually becomes part of subconscious expectation. Yet this same principle that creates suffering can also create freedom. For if repeated fear can condition the subconscious negatively, repeated peace can condition it positively. If repeated anxiety can create emotional weakness, repeated confidence can create emotional stability. The law itself remains unchanged. Only the impressions impressed upon the subconscious differ. This means the individual is never permanently trapped by old conditioning. The subconscious can always be impressed with new patterns, new expectations, new emotional assumptions, new mental images. Joseph Murphy taught that constructive repetition gradually replaces destructive conditioning when practiced faithfully and emotionally. The mind slowly begins accepting peace where fear once existed, confidence where insecurity once dominated, harmony where anxiety once ruled. But this transformation only begins once the individual becomes conscious of what they have been repeatedly impressing upon the subconscious mind every day. For whatever is emotionally repeated long enough eventually begins shaping reality from within outward. Joseph Murphy taught that prayer is not merely words spoken aloud. Prayer is the movement of thought and feeling within the mind. It is the emotional acceptance of an idea. It is sustained mental attention directed toward a condition believed to be true. Most people imagine prayer as something performed only during moments of worship or deliberate spiritual practice. But according to the deeper laws of the subconscious mind, human beings are praying constantly through their dominant emotional patterns. Every repeated expectation becomes a form of inner suggestion. Every emotionally sustained assumption becomes a subconscious impression. This is why worry becomes so dangerous. Because worry is not passive thinking. Worry is concentrated mental energy directed toward unwanted outcomes. It is sustained attention combined with fear. And whatever the mind continuously contemplates emotionally begins impressing itself upon the subconscious. The worried individual unknowingly prays for disaster internally while consciously wishing for peace externally. This contradiction creates enormous psychological conflict. The person says, "I want harmony," yet mentally rehearses chaos all day. They say, "I want success," yet constantly imagine failure emotionally. They say, "I want security," yet continuously expect loss, betrayal, rejection, or disappointment. The subconscious mind responds far more strongly to emotional conviction than surface-level desire. This is why fear-filled repetition gradually becomes subconscious expectation. Joseph Murphy often explained that the subconscious mind accepts the emotionalized thought as reality. This means that whatever the individual repeatedly fears eventually gains psychological substance internally.
The mind begins preparing for it.
The body reacts to it, behavior starts aligning with it, and slowly the feared condition begins moving closer through subconscious influence over perception, reaction, emotion, and decision-making. Many people unknowingly spend years praying negatively, not intentionally, but habitually. They repeat fearful internal conversations every day. What if something goes wrong? What if I embarrass myself? What if I fail? What if they reject me? What if life gets worse? What if I lose everything? These thoughts may appear harmless when viewed individually, but repeated thousands of times emotionally, they begin conditioning the subconscious mind deeply. The subconscious eventually stops recognizing them as temporary worries. It accepts them as expected reality. This is why chronic worriers often feel exhausted, even when nothing catastrophic has happened externally. The mind and body react to repeated fearful imagination as though danger already exists. Stress becomes normalized, tension becomes habitual, peace begins feeling unfamiliar. The nervous system remains trapped in anticipation. And because the subconscious responds to dominant emotional patterns continuously, the individual slowly becomes psychologically aligned with fear itself. Joseph Murphy warned repeatedly against allowing fear to occupy the imagination, because imagination magnifies whatever it repeatedly contemplates. The fearful person unknowingly rehearses suffering internally every day. They mentally relive conversations before they occur. They imagine worst-case outcomes repeatedly. They create emotional pain through anticipation long before reality unfolds. Then when negative events occasionally happen naturally, as they sometimes do in all human life, the person believes fear was justified. But often the fear itself helped intensify the suffering long before the event arrived. Worry weakens the mind because it divides attention between present reality and imagined disaster. The individual loses emotional clarity. They stop acting naturally. Fear begins interfering with intuition, confidence, creativity, courage, and judgment. The worried mind becomes rigid, obsessed with control, unable to trust life. And this constant inner tension eventually expresses itself outwardly through behavior and emotional atmosphere. People can often feel fear unconsciously in others, not through words alone, but through energy, hesitation, defensiveness, insecurity, and emotional instability. The subconscious mind communicates constantly through emotional states. This is why Joseph Murphy insisted that human beings must consciously redirect attention away from destructive mental rehearsal. For whatever is emotionally repeated long enough eventually begins shaping subconscious expectation. The law itself is impartial. The subconscious does not distinguish between constructive repetition and destructive repetition. It simply accepts what is impressed upon it most deeply. If a person constantly impresses fear, fear grows stronger internally. If a person repeatedly impresses peace, confidence, harmony, and faith, those conditions gradually become emotionally natural instead. This is why prayer, in the deeper sense, is not begging. It is not desperation. It is not fearful pleading. True prayer is calm, emotional acceptance of harmony before external proof appears. It is sustained faith rather than sustained fear. Joseph Murphy taught that the individual must learn to impress constructive ideas upon the subconscious repeatedly until they begin feeling emotionally true. Not mechanically repeated, emotionally accepted. This is the difference between shallow positive thinking and genuine subconscious transformation. The worried individual continues feeding fear daily. The peaceful individual gradually conditions trust internally. Instead, both are using the same subconscious laws, but in opposite directions. One rehearses disaster, the other rehearses harmony.
One conditions fear.
The other conditions confidence. And over time, the subconscious faithfully magnifies whichever emotional atmosphere dominates the mind most consistently. This is why human beings must become extremely careful about what they repeatedly contemplate emotionally. For sustained worry is never neutral. It is subconscious instruction. It is negative prayer repeated continuously through fear-filled expectation. And whatever the subconscious accepts deeply enough eventually seeks expression through the entire direction of the personality itself. One of the greatest powers within the human mind is imagination. Joseph Murphy taught that imagination is not merely fantasy. It is creative. It forms mental images that impress the subconscious mind continuously. And whatever the subconscious accepts deeply enough eventually begins expressing itself outwardly through emotional patterns, behavior, perception, and life experience. This is why fear often begins long before external events ever appear. It begins internally through imagination. A person imagines failure repeatedly. They imagine rejection before speaking. They imagine embarrassment before acting. They imagine illness before symptoms appear. They imagine betrayal before trust is broken. And because these images are repeated emotionally, the subconscious gradually begins accepting them as possible reality. Most people do not realize how often they use imagination destructively. The fearful mind constantly creates internal scenes of disaster. It mentally rehearses suffering. It visualizes problems repeatedly. And because imagination feels vivid emotionally, the subconscious responds powerfully to it. Joseph Murphy explained that whatever is impressed upon the subconscious with feeling becomes accepted as truth internally. This means imagination mixed with fear can gradually condition the mind toward unwanted outcomes.
The subconscious does not distinguish carefully between external events and emotionally sustained mental pictures.
It responds according to emotional acceptance. This is why human beings can become physically tense merely by imagining danger. The body reacts. The heart rate changes. Stress increases, muscles tighten, emotions shift, even though the imagined event has not actually occurred. The subconscious responds to vivid imagination as though the experience were already unfolding. And when fearful imagination becomes habitual, the entire personality slowly begins organizing itself around anticipated suffering. This is why fear becomes self-reinforcing. The individual imagines disaster repeatedly. The subconscious accepts the emotional pattern. Behavior changes unconsciously. Confidence weakens. Perception narrows. The individual becomes hesitant, defensive, uncertain, and emotionally unstable. Then life begins reflecting these internal conditions outwardly, and when negative experiences eventually occur, as they sometimes naturally do, the person believes the fear was accurate all along. But often, the fear itself helps shape the emotional and behavioral conditions surrounding the outcome. Joseph Murphy repeatedly warned against allowing the imagination to become dominated by fear, because imagination is one of the primary languages of the subconscious mind. The subconscious responds to mental pictures continuously. Whatever images are emotionally sustained eventually begin influencing subconscious expectation. This explains why fearful individuals often struggle to experience peace, even during calm moments. The imagination continues generating danger internally. The mind remains trapped in anticipation. Even silence feels threatening because the subconscious has become conditioned to expect disturbance. Many people unknowingly spend years imagining negative outcomes so frequently that fear becomes emotionally normal. They no longer recognize how deeply destructive their internal imagery has become. The mind automatically drifts toward worst-case scenarios. They assume rejection instinctively. They anticipate disappointment habitually. They mentally create suffering before reality even unfolds. This is one of the hidden reasons anxiety becomes exhausting. The individual is not only reacting to life externally, they are continuously generating emotional pressure internally through imagination. The subconscious faithfully absorbs these repeated impressions. And over time, the imagined fear begins feeling emotionally real. Joseph Murphy taught that the imagination must be disciplined constructively, not suppressed, directed. For imagination itself is not the enemy. It is one of the greatest creative faculties available to human beings. The same imagination that creates fear can also create confidence. The same imagination that rehearses failure can rehearse harmony. The same mind that visualizes disaster can visualize peace, success, healing, stability, and inner freedom. The law itself remains unchanged. The subconscious simply responds to whatever images are emotionally impressed upon it repeatedly. This is why many successful individuals instinctively imagine constructive outcomes long before external proof appears. They emotionally rehearse confidence, harmony, achievement, strength, possibility, and because these images are sustained consistently, the subconscious gradually accepts them as natural expectations. The fearful individual imagines limitation constantly. The confident individual imagines possibility. Instead, both are using imagination, but in completely different directions. Joseph Murphy emphasized that human beings must consciously choose the images they allow to dominate the mind, because every repeated mental picture becomes subconscious instruction eventually. The imagination is never idle. It is always shaping emotional atmosphere, internally, always influencing subconscious expectation. always moving the personality gradually toward whatever it repeatedly contemplates. This is why fear must be interrupted before it becomes subconscious reality. For every fearful image sustained emotionally becomes another impression planted within the deeper mind. And eventually the subconscious begins expressing outwardly what has been inwardly accepted through repeated imagination. The mind ultimately moves toward the images it believes most deeply. Whether those images create suffering or freedom depends entirely upon what the individual repeatedly chooses to sustain within imagination itself. Joseph Murphy taught that the subconscious mind constantly moves in the direction of what it accepts as true. This means human beings do not merely live according to circumstances. They live according to dominant expectation. Whatever the mind emotionally expects repeatedly eventually begins influencing the entire direction of behavior, perception, reaction, and experience. Expectation is one of the most powerful forces operating within the subconscious mind. For the subconscious does not simply respond to words. It responds to inner acceptance. A person may verbally desire success while emotionally expecting failure. They may speak confidently outwardly while internally anticipating rejection. And because the subconscious responds most deeply to emotional conviction, the hidden expectation eventually becomes stronger than surface-level desire. This explains why many individuals unknowingly move toward the very outcomes they consciously claim to fear. The subconscious mind always seeks consistency between inner expectation and outer experience. If fear dominates internally, the personality gradually aligns itself with fearful outcomes unconsciously. This process rarely happens suddenly. It happens gradually through emotional conditioning, repeated over time. The individual begins expecting disappointment naturally. Failure feels more believable than success. Conflict feels more believable than harmony. Loss feels more believable than abundance. And eventually, these expectations begin shaping daily behavior automatically. Joseph Murphy explained that whatever the subconscious accepts as probable eventually begins influencing action and reaction continuously. The fearful person hesitates, avoids opportunities, questions themselves constantly, overanalyzes simple situations, distrusts positive outcomes. And because these patterns influence behavior unconsciously, life gradually begins reflecting the expectation back outwardly. The individual then mistakes subconscious expectation for objective reality. But often, the expectation itself participated in shaping the experience. This is why two people can encounter the same opportunity while producing completely different results. One expects possibility. The other expects disappointment. One moves with confidence. The other moves with fear. One assumes things can work. The other anticipates failure before action even begins. And over time, these emotional expectations begin creating entirely different lives. The subconscious mind faithfully magnifies what is emotionally accepted repeatedly. If a person continuously expects rejection, they become emotionally defensive before conversations even begin. If they expect betrayal, they struggle to trust others naturally. If they expect failure, they hesitate during action. The expectation itself quietly alters behavior. This is one of the hidden ways fear becomes self-fulfilling. Joseph Murphy repeatedly emphasized that human beings must become aware of their dominant assumptions, because assumptions repeated emotionally eventually become subconscious law. The mind always moves toward what feels believable internally. This is why negative conditioning can become so powerful after years of repetition. The fearful expectation eventually stops feeling like fear. It begins feeling like realism. People say, I'm just being realistic. But many times, they are simply emotionally conditioned toward limitation.
The subconscious has accepted fear so deeply that possibility itself begins feeling unnatural.
This is why emotionally wounded individuals often struggle to trust peace, Even when life temporarily becomes calm, the subconscious continues expecting disturbance. The mind remains prepared for danger. And because expectation influences attention continuously, the individual notices evidence supporting fear everywhere. The mind searches for confirmation of what it already expects emotionally. Joseph Murphy taught that expectation acts like a mental command impressed upon the subconscious mind. The subconscious then works continuously to express that expectation outwardly through emotional atmosphere, reaction, perception, and behavioral alignment. The individual may not consciously realize this process is occurring, but the subconscious is always operating beneath the surface, always responding, always expressing dominant internal patterns. This is why fear becomes so dangerous. When expectation becomes habitual, the individual no longer merely experiences occasional fear. They begin expecting fear-based outcomes naturally. Disaster becomes anticipated. Disappointment becomes assumed. And over time, life begins reflecting those emotional assumptions outwardly more frequently. Yet this same law also operates positively. If fearful expectation can weaken the mind, constructive expectation can strengthen it. If repeated anticipation of failure creates hesitation, repeated anticipation of harmony can create confidence. The subconscious responds to both according to emotional acceptance. This is why Joseph Murphy taught that people must deliberately cultivate constructive expectation internally, not false optimism, not denial of reality, but disciplined emotional direction. The individual must gradually train the mind to expect harmony instead of disaster, possibility instead of limitation, peace instead of constant danger. The subconscious slowly begins accepting whatever is repeatedly sustained emotionally. This transformation requires repetition because old expectations often become deeply rooted through years of conditioning. But every time the individual consciously interrupts fear and redirects expectation constructively, new subconscious impressions begin forming. The mind slowly changes direction. Fear loses authority gradually. Confidence strengthens incrementally. And eventually, constructive expectation begins feeling emotionally natural instead of forced. Joseph Murphy taught that life often reflects the emotional atmosphere sustained within the subconscious mind. This is why expectation becomes one of the hidden architects of human experience. The fearful mind moves toward limitation unconsciously. The confident mind moves toward possibility. Instead, both are operating according to the same subconscious laws. Both are impressing emotional patterns upon the deeper mind continuously. And whatever expectation becomes dominant internally eventually begins shaping reality from within outward. Joseph Murphy taught that repetition is one of the primary ways the subconscious mind becomes conditioned. Whatever is repeated emotionally long enough eventually begins operating automatically beneath conscious awareness. This is why human beings often become prisoners of patterns they no longer consciously notice. The subconscious mind learns through repetition, not occasionally, but through repeated emotional reinforcement sustained over time. Every repeated reaction strengthens certain mental pathways internally. Every repeated fear deepens subconscious familiarity with fear itself. And eventually, the emotional pattern becomes automatic. The individual no longer consciously chooses the reaction. The reaction begins choosing them. This is why many people continue experiencing the same emotional struggles repeatedly throughout life. The subconscious has been programmed through years of repetition. Fear repeated becomes anxiety. Anxiety repeated becomes expectation. Expectation repeated becomes identity. And identity eventually begins shaping the entire direction of experience. Joseph Murphy emphasized that the subconscious mind does not reason the way the conscious mind does. It accepts repeated emotional impressions as truth. This means that whatever a person repeatedly feels eventually becomes psychologically natural. If fear is repeated daily, fear begins feeling normal. If insecurity is repeated constantly, insecurity becomes familiar. If the individual repeatedly anticipates rejection, criticism, failure, or betrayal, the subconscious gradually accepts these emotional states as expected reality. Then the mind begins reproducing those patterns automatically. Many people unknowingly spend years programming limitation into the subconscious through repetition. They repeat the same fearful internal conversations constantly. I cannot do this. Life is difficult. People always disappoint me. I always fail eventually. Nothing ever changes. These thoughts may appear harmless individually, but emotional repetition gives them power. The subconscious absorbs them continuously, and eventually the mind begins operating according to those assumptions automatically. This is why emotionally repeated thought becomes more powerful than occasional positive thinking. A person cannot spend years emotionally conditioning fear and expect a few moments of temporary optimism to erase the subconscious pattern immediately. The subconscious changes gradually through sustained emotional repetition. Joseph Murphy taught that constructive conditioning requires consistency. The subconscious must repeatedly receive new impressions until those impressions begin feeling emotionally natural. This is why transformation often feels uncomfortable initially. The mind has grown accustomed to old emotional patterns. Fear feels familiar. Limitation feels believable. Peace may initially feel unnatural because the subconscious has not yet fully accepted it. But repetition slowly reshapes emotional expectation over time. This law operates constantly whether a person understands it or not. The subconscious is always recording repeated emotional experiences, always strengthening what is continually practiced internally. If a person repeatedly reacts with fear, fear strengthens. If they repeatedly react with confidence, confidence strengthens instead. The emotional atmosphere sustained daily eventually becomes subconscious programming. This explains why repeated exposure to negativity can slowly alter the personality itself. Fearful media, fearful conversations, fearful imagination, fearful self-talk. All of these become repeated impressions entering the subconscious continuously. And because the subconscious magnifies what is repeated most consistently, emotional atmosphere becomes extremely important. Joseph Murphy warned repeatedly that people must guard the mind carefully because the subconscious accepts repetition without judgment. It does not ask whether the repeated pattern serves your well-being. It simply absorbs what is emotionally reinforced most often. This is why destructive habits become difficult to break after years of repetition. The subconscious has accepted them as emotionally familiar, and the mind naturally gravitates toward what feels familiar internally. Even suffering can become psychologically familiar after enough repetition. This is one of the hidden reasons many individuals unconsciously recreate painful emotional patterns repeatedly throughout life. The subconscious seeks emotional consistency, not necessarily happiness. If chaos becomes familiar, peace may initially feel uncomfortable. If fear becomes familiar, confidence may initially feel unnatural. The subconscious continues pulling the personality back toward old conditioning until new patterns become emotionally stronger through repetition. Joseph Murphy taught that this same law can be used consciously and constructively. For if fear can be programmed through repetition, peace can also be programmed through repetition. If insecurity can become habitual, confidence can become habitual as well. If limitation can become emotionally accepted, abundance and harmony can also become emotionally accepted. The subconscious simply responds to what is repeatedly impressed upon it. This is why disciplined mental repetition becomes so powerful. Not mechanical repetition, emotional repetition. Thoughts repeated with feeling gradually enter the deeper mind. And once the subconscious accepts a new emotional pattern fully, behavior, reaction, expectation, and perception slowly begin changing automatically. The individual no longer struggles to force positive behavior. Artificially, the subconscious itself begins supporting the new pattern naturally. This is the true meaning of subconscious reconditioning. The mind gradually becomes aligned with what has been emotionally repeated long enough. Joseph Murphy understood that human beings are constantly programming themselves, whether consciously or unconsciously. Every repeated emotional state becomes instruction. Every dominant reaction becomes reinforcement. Every sustained mental atmosphere becomes subconscious conditioning. And eventually, the subconscious faithfully expresses outwardly whatever has been repeatedly accepted inwardly. The fearful person programs fear continuously. The peaceful person programs harmony instead. Both are using the same subconscious laws. Both are shaping emotional reality through repetition. And whatever emotional pattern becomes strongest internally eventually begins directing the entire personality from beneath conscious awareness.
Joseph Murphy taught that the subconscious mind faithfully reproduces what is emotionally accepted most deeply.
This is one of the reasons fear can become self-fulfilling. Not because human beings magically attract suffering through a single fearful thought, but because repeated fear gradually conditions the entire personality toward the feared outcome. The fearful individual unknowingly aligns perception, emotion, behavior, and expectation with what they continuously contemplate internally. And over time, life begins reflecting those internal patterns outwardly. Most people do not realize how much influence fear has over behavior. They believe fear exists solely inside the mind. But fear alters the body, the voice, the posture, the emotional atmosphere, the willingness to act,
the ability to trust,
the courage to persist. Fear changes how people speak to others, how they respond to opportunities, how they interpret situations, how they react under pressure. And because these subtle changes accumulate over time, fear gradually begins shaping external experience, indirectly through subconscious influence. Joseph Murphy explained that whatever dominates the subconscious eventually seeks expression. This means that fearful expectation silently influences countless small reactions throughout daily life. The fearful person may hesitate during important moments, avoid meaningful opportunities, withdraw emotionally from relationships, expect criticism before speaking, distrust success while pursuing it. And because the subconscious continuously seeks consistency with dominant emotional patterns, these reactions gradually reinforce the original fear. This is why people often believe life is confirming their fears. But many times, the subconscious conditioning itself participated in creating the emotional and behavioral conditions surrounding the outcome. Fear rarely remains passive. It quietly shapes the personality from beneath conscious awareness. A person afraid of rejection may become emotionally guarded, distant, overly cautious, unable to express themselves naturally. Then relationships become strained. The individual experiences rejection eventually and concludes, "I knew this would happen," without realizing the fear itself influenced the behavior that helped produce the result. A person afraid of failure may overthink every decision, delay action, lose confidence under pressure, avoid necessary risks, and when failure eventually appears, they interpret it as proof that fear was justified. But often, fear weakened the natural intelligence and confidence required for success long before the event unfolded. Joseph Murphy repeatedly warned that fear conditions the subconscious mind toward limitation. The subconscious always moves toward what is emotionally accepted repeatedly. If disaster becomes emotionally expected, the personality unconsciously begins preparing for disaster constantly. This preparation affects emotional atmosphere continuously. The fearful individual lives defensively, not creatively. They stop moving naturally through life. Instead, they become psychologically occupied with avoiding pain, and when avoidance becomes dominant, freedom gradually disappears. This is one of the deepest dangers of fear. It narrows the mind. It reduces imagination. It weakens spontaneity. It limits courage. It slowly transforms life into emotional survival rather than genuine living. The subconscious then magnifies this fearful atmosphere internally until the individual begins experiencing the world primarily through anticipated danger. Joseph Murphy taught that the subconscious mind does not distinguish between constructive expectation and destructive expectation. It responds according to emotional conviction. If a person repeatedly fears humiliation, they mentally rehearse humiliation constantly. If they repeatedly fear poverty, they emotionally identify with loss internally. If they repeatedly fear abandonment, they unconsciously expect instability within relationships. And eventually, these emotional assumptions begin influencing behavior so strongly that life starts reflecting the fear outwardly more frequently. This is why fear can appear strangely magnetic. The individual unconsciously participates in creating conditions aligned with the emotional atmosphere dominating the subconscious mind. The fearful person notices threats constantly, expects disappointment naturally, interprets uncertainty negatively, and reacts emotionally from insecurity rather than calm intelligence. Then reality slowly becomes filtered through fear-conditioned perception. Joseph Murphy emphasized that this law also works positively. If fear can attract limitation psychologically, faith can attract harmony psychologically. If fearful expectation can weaken behavior, confident expectation can strengthen behavior instead. The subconscious responds faithfully to whichever emotional atmosphere dominates most consistently. This is why two individuals facing identical circumstances can experience entirely different outcomes. One is psychologically aligned with possibility. The other is psychologically aligned with fear. One moves with trust. The other moves with tension. One acts creatively. The other reacts defensively. And over time, their inner emotional assumptions begin shaping completely different realities. The subconscious faithfully magnifies dominant internal patterns, whether constructive or destructive. This is why Joseph Murphy taught that human beings must consciously interrupt fear before it becomes emotionally rooted within the subconscious mind. For whatever becomes emotionally rooted eventually begins expressing itself automatically through the entire personality. The fearful person unknowingly conditions suffering internally. The peaceful person conditions harmony instead. Both are impressing emotional patterns upon the subconscious continuously. And whatever emotional pattern becomes dominant eventually shapes perception, reaction, behavior, expectation, and ultimately the direction of life itself. The mind always moves toward what it repeatedly accepts emotionally. This is why fear becomes dangerous when sustained long enough. Not because fear possesses mystical power, but because the subconscious faithfully reproduces whatever the individual continues emotionally believing to be true. Joseph Murphy taught that the subconscious mind responds to thought and feeling whether the experience is physically present or merely imagined vividly. This is one of the reasons fear becomes so powerful within human life. The body itself begins responding to imagined danger, as though the danger were already real. A person may sit safely inside a quiet room while imagining catastrophe internally. Yet the heart begins racing. Muscles tighten, breathing changes, stress increases. The nervous system reacts immediately. Why? Because the subconscious responds to emotionally accepted mental images continuously. The body follows the mind. This is why prolonged fear eventually exhausts the entire personality, physically, emotionally, and psychologically. The fearful individual lives under constant internal tension. Even when external conditions appear calm, the subconscious continues reacting to imagined threat. Joseph Murphy explained that sustained fearful thinking gradually impresses the subconscious mind so deeply that the body itself begins adapting to fear as a normal condition. This is why chronic anxiety often becomes physically exhausting. The individual is not only reacting to actual problems, they are reacting to imagined problems repeatedly. Throughout the day, the subconscious does not wait for external confirmation before influencing the body. It responds according to emotional conviction. If a person vividly imagines humiliation repeatedly, the body experiences stress. If they imagine illness constantly, tension increases internally. If they anticipate disaster habitually, the nervous system remains trapped in preparation. This is one of the hidden reasons fear becomes self-destructive. Over time, the individual unknowingly lives inside continuous anticipation. The body never fully relaxes. The mind never fully rests. Peace becomes unfamiliar because the subconscious has become conditioned toward alertness and emotional defense. Joseph Murphy warned repeatedly against allowing fear to dominate thought, because sustained emotional tension gradually weakens the harmony of the entire personality. The fearful individual becomes restless, irritable, mentally exhausted, unable to think clearly, unable to trust life naturally. This happens because the subconscious continuously translates emotional expectation into bodily response. The mind and body are not separate systems operating independently. They constantly influence one another. Fearful thought creates emotional tension. Emotional tension affects the body. The body then reinforces the emotional state, and gradually fear becomes physically embedded within daily experience. This is why many people remain trapped inside anxiety cycles for years. The subconscious has conditioned the nervous system toward anticipation. Even ordinary situations begin triggering stress automatically. A simple conversation feels threatening. Silence feels uncomfortable. Uncertainty feels dangerous. The body reacts before the conscious mind fully understands why. Joseph Murphy taught that whatever the subconscious accepts repeatedly eventually expresses itself through the entire personality. This includes emotional patterns, physical reactions, habits of behavior, and general mental atmosphere. The fearful individual may not consciously desire suffering, but years of repeated fearful imagination condition the subconscious toward tension continuously. And eventually, the body itself begins reflecting the internal emotional environment. This is why many individuals become exhausted, not from life itself, but from continuous internal resistance to imagined disaster. The mind keeps preparing for danger that has not arrived. The nervous system remains trapped in anticipation. And over time, emotional exhaustion begins feeling normal. The subconscious faithfully magnifies whatever emotional atmosphere dominates most consistently. If fear dominates internally, tension increases externally. If peace dominates internally, the body gradually responds differently. Joseph Murphy emphasized that calm, constructive thinking helps restore harmony, because the subconscious responds to peaceful impressions just as faithfully as it responds to fearful impressions. The same mind that creates tension can also create relaxation. The same imagination that produces anxiety can also produce emotional stability. This is why disciplined emotional direction becomes extremely important. The body is constantly listening to the subconscious mind. Every repeated emotional reaction sends signals throughout the nervous system. Every dominant expectation influences physical response. And eventually the body itself becomes conditioned according to the emotional atmosphere sustained internally. This is one reason why fear becomes so dangerous when allowed to continue unchecked. The fearful person unknowingly trains the entire personality towards stress. Thought patterns become fearful. Emotions become unstable. The body becomes tense. Behavior becomes defensive. And life gradually begins revolving around avoiding anticipated pain rather than experiencing genuine freedom. Joseph Murphy taught that harmony must first be accepted internally before it can fully express itself externally. The subconscious must gradually receive new impressions of peace, safety, confidence, and emotional stability. As these impressions deepen, the nervous system slowly begins relaxing. The body stops preparing constantly for imagined disaster. The mind regains clarity, emotional balance strengthens, and the individual slowly begins experiencing life differently because the subconscious itself is changing direction. The body ultimately reflects the emotional atmosphere impressed upon the subconscious mind most consistently. Fear creates tension. Peace creates harmony. And whatever emotional state becomes dominant internally eventually expresses itself throughout the entire personality from within outward. Joseph Murphy taught that the subconscious mind influences far more than emotion alone. It shapes perception itself. This means human beings do not always see reality objectively. They often see reality through the emotional conditioning impressed upon the subconscious mind over many years. The fearful individual interprets life differently than the peaceful individual. Fear alters perception. It changes how situations are understood, how people are interpreted, how risks are evaluated, how opportunities are approached. And because the subconscious constantly filters experience through dominant emotional expectation, fear gradually distorts the individual's relationship with reality itself. A person deeply conditioned by fear may begin perceiving danger where no danger truly exists. Neutral situations feel threatening. Constructive criticism feels like personal attack. Temporary uncertainty feels catastrophic. Silence feels uncomfortable. Delays feel like disaster. And because perception becomes emotionally distorted, the individual reacts not to reality itself, but to the fearful interpretation created internally. Joseph Murphy explained that whatever dominates the subconscious eventually colors the conscious mind. This means fearful conditioning eventually influences attention automatically. The individual begins noticing problems more than possibilities, threats more than opportunities, limitations more than solutions. The mind searches continuously for evidence supporting its dominant emotional assumptions. This is one reason fear becomes self-reinforcing. The fearful person unconsciously filters reality through anticipated danger. Then they interpret the world as confirmation of what they already emotionally expect. Fear also distorts behavior. The subconscious influences countless reactions beneath conscious awareness. Tone of voice changes, posture changes, facial expression changes. Confidence weakens, natural spontaneity disappears. The fearful person often becomes hesitant without fully understanding why. They overthink simple decisions, delay action unnecessarily, seek excessive reassurance, avoid uncertainty constantly. And because fear weakens natural confidence, behavior gradually becomes more defensive and restricted. Joseph Murphy warned that fearful thinking eventually imprisons the imagination. The individual stops acting creatively. They begin acting protectively. Instead, life becomes centered around avoiding pain rather than expressing possibility. And once avoidance becomes dominant, growth begins slowing dramatically. Fearful individuals often remain trapped inside familiar limitations because the subconscious associates unfamiliarity with danger. Even positive change may trigger anxiety because the subconscious prefers emotional familiarity over uncertainty. This is why people sometimes sabotage opportunities they consciously desire. The subconscious fears the unknown more than it desires transformation. Fear also weakens decision-making. The fearful mind struggles to think clearly because emotional tension interferes with perception and judgment. The individual becomes reactive,
impulsive at times,
paralyzed at others. unable to distinguish genuine intuition from emotional anxiety. Joseph Murphy taught that fear clouds the intelligence of the conscious mind. The subconscious becomes occupied with survival rather than clarity. This creates inner confusion. The individual second-guesses themselves constantly, questions every decision, obsesses over possible mistakes, and because fear magnifies imagined consequences emotionally, even small decisions can begin feeling overwhelming. This is why prolonged fear often produces mental exhaustion. The individual is not merely living life. They are mentally fighting imagined catastrophe continuously. The subconscious remains trapped in emotional defense, and eventually the personality itself becomes conditioned toward insecurity. Joseph Murphy repeatedly emphasized that peace strengthens intelligence, while fear weakens it. A calm mind perceives more clearly, acts more naturally, responds more wisely. The peaceful individual remains emotionally flexible, able to adapt, able to trust judgment, able to think constructively rather than defensively. But when fear dominates internally, perception narrows. Attention fixates upon danger, and behavior gradually becomes shaped by emotional protection instead of conscious direction. This is one reason fear silently limits human potential, not because people lack ability, but because fear distorts the perception of possibility itself. The fearful individual often underestimates themselves automatically, avoids action prematurely, and unconsciously creates smaller lives than they are capable of living. Joseph Murphy taught that the subconscious must gradually be impressed with harmony instead of fear. The mind must learn safety internally. Otherwise, the subconscious continues interpreting uncertainty as danger automatically. This transformation requires emotional reconditioning. The individual must repeatedly interrupt fearful interpretation and consciously redirect attention toward constructive perception, not through denial, but through disciplined inner direction. For the subconscious eventually accepts whatever emotional atmosphere is repeated consistently enough. As peace strengthens internally, perception begins changing. The individual no longer interprets every uncertainty negatively. They stop anticipating disaster constantly. Behavior becomes calmer. Decision-making becomes clearer. Confidence begins returning naturally. The subconscious slowly stops filtering reality through fear. And once fear loses its dominance internally, the individual begins experiencing life differently entirely. Joseph Murphy understood that the world people experience externally is often deeply connected to the emotional conditioning operating internally. The fearful mind experiences a fearful world. The peaceful mind experiences a more harmonious one. Both are viewing reality through subconscious expectation. And whatever emotional pattern dominates the subconscious eventually shapes not only what people feel, but how they perceive, behave, decide, and ultimately live. Joseph Murphy often spoke about what he called the law of reversed effort. This principle explains why fear frequently becomes stronger the more violently a person struggles against it internally. The conscious mind attempts to force confidence, but the subconscious remains filled with emotional fear. And because the subconscious responds more strongly to deeply accepted feeling than conscious force, the fear persists. Many individuals spend years fighting fear incorrectly. They resist it aggressively, suppress it, argue with it, panic about it. And through this emotional struggle, they unknowingly continue feeding the fear additional energy. The more emotionally obsessed they become with eliminating fear instantly, the more attention fear receives internally. And whatever receives sustained emotional attention gradually strengthens within the subconscious mind. This is why the fearful individual often says, "The harder I try to stop worrying, the worse it becomes." Joseph Murphy explained that excessive force creates inner conflict. The conscious mind attempts to command peace, while the subconscious continues expecting danger emotionally. This contradiction creates tension, and tension itself reinforces fear. The subconscious does not respond well to desperate internal struggle. It responds more naturally to calm emotional acceptance and repeated constructive impression. The fearful person often makes the mistake of constantly monitoring themselves internally. They search for signs of fear continuously, analyze every emotion, obsess over every anxious thought. And through this constant attention, fear remains psychologically active within the mind. The individual becomes emotionally entangled with the very condition they are attempting to escape. Joseph Murphy taught that what is resisted emotionally often persists because emotional resistance itself becomes another form of attention. The subconscious continues receiving the impression that fear is important, powerful, dangerous, and central to survival. As long as this emotional importance remains, the subconscious continues magnifying the fearful pattern. This is why many people remain trapped inside cycles of anxiety for years. They fear the fear itself, and this secondary fear deepens the original conditioning further. The mind becomes trapped in internal conflict. The individual desperately wants peace while emotionally expecting fear. The conscious mind says, I must stop feeling this, but the subconscious hears continuous emotional alarm. And because emotional conviction impresses the subconscious more deeply than forced mental effort, fear continues operating automatically. Joseph Murphy explained that true transformation does not come through emotional struggle. It comes through subconscious reconditioning. The individual must gradually impress the subconscious with calm, constructive emotional patterns, repeatedly until peace begins, feeling more natural than fear. This process cannot be forced violently. The subconscious changes through emotional acceptance, repetition, and relaxed conviction. Not panic, not desperation, not obsessive self-monitoring. This is why many people experience temporary relief when they stop fighting fear aggressively. The nervous system relaxes, internal resistance decreases, and the subconscious slowly becomes more receptive to constructive impressions. Joseph Murphy often emphasized the importance of relaxed faith, not strained effort. The fearful individual frequently tries too hard. They attempt to force certainty immediately, force emotional control, force confidence artificially, but excessive forcing itself communicates subconscious insecurity. The mind becomes emotionally rigid, unable to relax, unable to trust, and because the subconscious responds poorly to tension, the fearful pattern continues operating beneath the surface. The law of reversed effort explains why sleep often becomes difficult when a person tries desperately to force sleep. The harder they struggle, the more awake they become. The same principle applies psychologically. The harder the fearful individual struggles emotionally against fear itself, the more attention and emotional importance fear receives internally. Joseph Murphy taught that the subconscious responds best to calm repetition combined with relaxed emotional acceptance. The individual must stop worshiping fear through constant struggle. They must stop treating fear as an all-powerful force. Instead, they must gradually redirect attention toward peace, consistently and patiently. Not through denial of fear, but through emotional retraining. The subconscious slowly changes when new emotional impressions become stronger than old conditioning. This requires persistence without emotional violence. The fearful person must learn to stop feeding fear through obsession. Stop rehearsing it mentally. Stop monitoring every emotional fluctuation constantly. And begin cultivating inner calm, gradually through disciplined, constructive focus. Joseph Murphy understood that emotional force often strengthens the very condition being resisted. But calm subconscious reconditioning slowly dissolves fear naturally over time. This is why peaceful repetition becomes more powerful than emotional struggle. The subconscious eventually accepts whatever emotional atmosphere is sustained most consistently. If tension dominates, fear strengthens. If calm conviction dominates, peace strengthens instead. The law itself remains impartial. The subconscious faithfully magnifies whatever emotional pattern becomes dominant internally. This is why freedom from fear begins not through violent resistance, but through patient emotional redirection. The mind gradually moves toward whatever it repeatedly accepts in a relaxed and emotionally convincing manner. And once peace becomes emotionally familiar to the subconscious, fear slowly loses the authority it once possessed over the personality. Joseph Murphy taught that many of the subconscious impressions governing adult life are formed long before individuals fully understand the power of their own minds. The subconscious mind is highly impressionable during childhood. It absorbs emotional atmosphere continuously, words spoken repeatedly, emotional reactions witnessed constantly, fearful environments, criticism, shame, conflict. All of these gradually enter the subconscious mind and begin shaping emotional expectation. A child does not analyze experience the way an adult attempts to. The subconscious absorbs impressions directly. This is why repeated emotional experiences during early life often become deeply rooted subconscious patterns later on. A child repeatedly exposed to fear may unconsciously learn that life is dangerous. A child repeatedly criticized may subconsciously accept feelings of inadequacy. A child raised with an emotional instability may unconsciously begin expecting uncertainty and tension as normal conditions of life. And because these impressions become emotionally familiar early, they often continue operating automatically for many years beneath conscious awareness. Joseph Murphy explained that the subconscious faithfully records emotional experience, whether constructive or destructive. This means childhood emotional atmosphere becomes extremely important, not because human beings are permanently trapped by the past, but because repeated early impressions often shape subconscious expectation before conscious awareness fully develops. Many adults unknowingly continue reacting from subconscious fear patterns created years earlier. They fear rejection intensely without understanding why. They struggle to trust success, fear abandonment constantly, expect criticism automatically, avoid emotional vulnerability, or become deeply anxious during uncertainty. The conscious mind may not remember every experience clearly, but the subconscious continues operating according to emotional conditioning formed through repetition. This is why fear can sometimes feel irrational, even to the individual experiencing it. The emotional reaction originates from subconscious association rather than present reality alone. A harmless situation unconsciously activates old emotional conditioning. And because the subconscious reacts automatically, the person experiences fear before conscious reasoning fully intervenes. Joseph Murphy repeatedly emphasized that subconscious impressions become powerful through emotional acceptance and repetition. This is especially true during childhood because young minds absorb emotional atmosphere intensely. Children naturally trust authority, accept repeated statements emotionally, and internalize the emotional tone surrounding them. If fear dominates the environment consistently, fear often becomes emotionally familiar within the subconscious mind. This is one reason many individuals unconsciously recreate emotional patterns later in life. The subconscious gravitates toward what feels familiar internally. Even painful patterns can feel psychologically normal after years of conditioning. A person raised around emotional instability may unconsciously expect unstable relationships. A person raised around criticism may subconsciously anticipate rejection constantly. A person repeatedly taught fear may begin interpreting uncertainty as danger automatically. The subconscious simply continues expressing the emotional patterns it learned through repetition. Joseph Murphy taught that the subconscious mind itself is impersonal. It does not morally judge the impressions it receives. It faithfully magnifies whatever becomes emotionally rooted most deeply. This means fearful conditioning formed during childhood can continue shaping adult behavior unconsciously until the individual becomes aware of it consciously. The fearful adult often believes, "This is just who I am." But many times the personality has simply adapted to subconscious conditioning repeated over many years. Fear became practice, rehearsed, normalized, emotionally accepted, and eventually it became identity. This is why subconscious transformation requires more than intellectual understanding alone. The subconscious must gradually receive new emotional impressions strong enough to weaken old conditioning. Joseph Murphy emphasized repeatedly that no person is permanently imprisoned by past impressions. The subconscious can always be reconditioned. New emotional patterns can always be planted. New assumptions can gradually replace old fears. But transformation requires persistence, because early conditioning often feels emotionally natural, even when it creates suffering. The individual must slowly teach the subconscious that peace is safe, that confidence is possible, that uncertainty does not automatically mean danger, that life does not need to be lived defensively forever. This process takes patience because the subconscious changes gradually through emotional repetition, not force, not self-hatred, not violent rejection of the past. The fearful individual must learn to stop identifying completely with old conditioning. For the subconscious may have absorbed fear during earlier years, but the mind is still capable of receiving entirely new impressions. Joseph Murphy believed deeply in the power of conscious reconditioning. The subconscious responds to whatever emotional atmosphere becomes dominant over time. This means even deeply rooted fear patterns can slowly weaken when peace, confidence, trust, and constructive expectation are repeated consistently enough. The old emotional associations begin losing authority gradually. The nervous system relaxes, behavior changes, perception changes, and eventually the individual begins responding to life differently because the subconscious itself is no longer operating according to the same fearful assumptions. Childhood conditioning may shape the beginning of subconscious expectation, but Joseph Murphy taught that conscious emotional direction can reshape the future entirely. For the subconscious ultimately reflects whatever impressions are repeatedly accepted most deeply over time. And once constructive impressions become stronger than fearful conditioning, the mind slowly begins moving toward freedom instead of fear. Joseph Murphy taught that fear is not the same thing as intelligence. Many people confuse psychological fear with wisdom, but there is a profound difference between constructive caution and subconscious fear conditioning. Constructive caution is calm,
clear,
balanced. It observes reality intelligently without emotional panic. Psychological fear, however, distorts perception and dominates the imagination emotionally. One protects, the other imprisons. Constructive caution allows human beings to act wisely. A person locks their door at night, drives carefully, prepares responsibly, pays attention to genuine danger when necessary. But once the situation passes, the mind returns naturally to peace. Fear does not continue controlling the imagination afterward. Psychological fear operates very differently. The fearful individual remains emotionally occupied long after danger disappears. The imagination continues generating catastrophe internally. The mind rehearses negative possibilities repeatedly, and because the subconscious responds to emotional repetition, fear gradually becomes part of the personality itself. Joseph Murphy repeatedly warned that many individuals unknowingly worship fear while believing they are simply being realistic. They constantly expect disaster, prepare emotionally for suffering, distrust peace, and mentally rehearse failure continuously. Then they justify this emotional conditioning by calling it caution. But true caution does not destroy inner peace. True caution does not paralyze action. True caution does not imprison imagination. Constructive intelligence remains emotionally stable. Fear becomes emotionally obsessive. This is one of the clearest differences between the two. The cautious individual observes danger rationally. The fearful individual becomes psychologically consumed by anticipated danger. One responds when necessary, the other remains trapped in emotional anticipation constantly. Joseph Murphy taught that the subconscious mind magnifies whatever emotional atmosphere dominates most consistently. This means chronic fear eventually begins shaping perception, expectation, and behavior automatically. The fearful individual stops responding to actual reality. Instead, they begin reacting to imagined catastrophe internally. A person operating from constructive caution may recognize risk while still remaining calm, able to think clearly, able to adapt intelligently, able to trust judgment. But when fear dominates, emotional clarity weakens.
The mind narrows.
The individual overestimates danger and underestimates possibility. This is why fear silently reduces human freedom over time. People begin avoiding experiences unnecessarily, avoid opportunities, avoid emotional vulnerability, avoid growth, avoid uncertainty, and eventually, avoidance itself becomes a subconscious habit. Life gradually becomes smaller because fear continues defining what feels emotionally safe. Joseph Murphy explained that the subconscious always moves toward what feels emotionally familiar. If fear becomes familiar, the personality begins organizing itself around emotional protection rather than meaningful living. The fearful individual may convince themselves they are simply being cautious, but inwardly, the subconscious remains trapped in tension continuously. This tension affects the body, behavior, relationships, decision-making, and emotional well-being. Constructive caution does not create chronic emotional exhaustion. Fear does. Constructive caution preserves intelligence. Fear clouds it. Constructive caution remains temporary. Fear becomes habitual. This distinction becomes extremely important because many people spend years strengthening fear unconsciously while believing they are protecting themselves. Joseph Murphy taught that human beings must learn to distinguish genuine wisdom from emotionally conditioned fear. Wisdom observes reality calmly. Fear magnifies imagined suffering emotionally. Wisdom acts intelligently without emotional slavery. Fear reacts compulsively from subconscious insecurity. The cautious person remains capable of peace. The fearful person struggles to relax because the subconscious continues expecting danger internally. This is why fear often survives even when circumstances improve externally. The subconscious has become conditioned toward anticipation. Peace feels unfamiliar. Safety feels temporary. The mind remains emotionally defensive because fear has become psychologically rooted. Joseph Murphy believed that human beings were never meant to live in continuous subconscious tension. The mind functions best when grounded in calm confidence rather than chronic emotional alarm. This does not mean ignoring reality. It means refusing to emotionally surrender imagination to fear continuously. Constructive caution acknowledges danger intelligently when necessary, but psychological fear lives inside imagined disaster constantly. One preserves life, the other diminishes it. This is why subconscious reconditioning becomes necessary. The individual must gradually teach the subconscious that uncertainty does not automatically mean catastrophe.
That life can be approached with intelligence, without emotional imprisonment.
That peace itself is safe. Joseph Murphy taught that calm confidence strengthens perception far more effectively than fear ever could. For fear distorts,
But peace clarifies.
Fear weakens judgment. Peace strengthens it. And whatever emotional atmosphere dominates the subconscious eventually begins directing the entire personality from within outward. The fearful person unconsciously lives defensively. The peaceful person lives intelligently without surrendering the imagination to chronic emotional fear. Both may recognize danger, but only one remains inwardly free. Joseph Murphy taught that human beings are constantly speaking to themselves, internally, whether they realize it, consciously or not. These inner conversations gradually become subconscious impressions. And whatever the subconscious accepts repeatedly eventually begins expressing itself outwardly through emotional atmosphere, perception, behavior, and life experience. Most people pay careful attention to the words they speak publicly, but they rarely observe the silent conversations taking place within the mind every day. Yet, according to Joseph Murphy, these inner conversations often shape life far more powerfully than outward speech. The subconscious listens continuously. Every repeated statement becomes instruction. Every emotionally charged inner dialogue becomes subconscious conditioning. This is why negative internal conversations become so dangerous over time. A person may smile outwardly while inwardly repeating, "I'm not good enough. People do not respect me. Life is against me. Something bad will happen. I always ruin things. I will probably fail." These thoughts may appear private, but the subconscious absorbs them constantly, and eventually the personality begins aligning with them automatically. Joseph Murphy explained that the subconscious does not distinguish between statements spoken aloud and statements emotionally repeated internally. Both become impressions. Both influence expectation. Both shape emotional reality gradually. The individual who continuously speaks fear internally eventually conditions the subconscious toward fear-based living. This affects confidence, decision-making,
relationship,
emotional stability, and the general atmosphere surrounding the personality itself. The fearful inner conversation becomes a form of subconscious instruction repeated daily. Many individuals unknowingly spend years criticizing themselves internally. They rehearse insecurity continuously, judge themselves harshly, expect rejection automatically, and speak internally as though failure were inevitable. Then they wonder why peace feels distant and confidence feels unnatural. The subconscious faithfully reflects whatever emotional atmosphere dominates internal conversation most consistently. Joseph Murphy repeatedly emphasized that human beings eventually become what they emotionally contemplate and inwardly affirm repeatedly. This is why inner speech matters profoundly. A person who constantly tells themselves, "Life is difficult. I cannot trust anyone. Nothing ever changes. I always suffer," gradually conditions the subconscious toward those expectations emotionally. The mind begins searching for confirmation. Behavior shifts unconsciously, and eventually life itself starts reflecting the internal atmosphere outwardly more frequently. The subconscious always seeks consistency between inner acceptance and outer expression. This is why fearful inner conversations quietly shape the personality over time. The fearful individual becomes tense internally before external events even unfold. They mentally argue with imagined criticism, rehearse conflict, expect disappointment, defend themselves emotionally against situations that had not even occurred. And because the subconscious reacts to emotional repetition continuously, these inner conversations begin influencing daily experience automatically. Joseph Murphy taught that inner speech eventually becomes subconscious law when repeated with emotional conviction long enough. This means many people unknowingly imprison themselves psychologically through habitual internal dialogue, not because they consciously desire suffering, but because the subconscious continues magnifying what is emotionally repeated most consistently. The inner world eventually influences the outer world. The person who inwardly rehearses failure often behaves differently than the person who inwardly rehearses harmony. Confidence changes, emotional presence changes, perception changes. The entire personality gradually shifts according to the dominant internal conversation. Joseph Murphy understood that the subconscious mind accepts emotionalized thought as reality. This is why fearful self-talk becomes deeply destructive. The subconscious cannot protect the individual from thoughts the individual continuously impresses upon it voluntarily. If fear is repeated internally every day, the subconscious gradually accepts fear as normal expectation. This is why many people unknowingly become emotionally exhausted without understanding the true source. The mind never rests from internal conflict. The inner conversation remains negative continuously. And because the subconscious absorbs every repeated emotional statement, the personality slowly becomes shaped by those internal patterns. Yet Joseph Murphy also taught that this same law can transform human life constructively. If destructive inner conversation can weaken the subconscious, constructive inner conversation can strengthen it. If repeated fear can create insecurity, repeated peace can gradually create confidence instead. The subconscious responds faithfully to whichever emotional atmosphere dominates consistently enough. This is why disciplined inner speech becomes extremely important. Not artificial positivity disconnected from reality, but calm, constructive direction. The individual must gradually learn to speak internally with harmony rather than fear, confidence rather than self-condemnation, possibility rather than constant limitation. Joseph Murphy believed the subconscious could be reconditioned through repeated constructive suggestion combined with emotional acceptance. The inner conversation slowly changes. The emotional atmosphere shifts, and eventually the subconscious begins accepting peace as emotionally natural rather than unfamiliar. As this transformation deepens, outer behavior changes automatically.
Confidence strengthens.
Relationships improve, perception becomes clearer, fear weakens gradually, and the individual begins experiencing life differently because the subconscious itself is no longer being fed continuous emotional negativity. The mind always reflects what it repeatedly hears internally. This is why human beings must become careful guardians of inner conversation. For every repeated emotional statement eventually becomes subconscious instruction. And whatever becomes rooted within the subconscious eventually seeks expression through the direction of life itself.